Hello. Today I'm going to be taking a look at a game that comprises a genre that I don't have much of a history of playing, but nonetheless has proved one of the more cripplingly addictive endeavours that I've undertaken recently. The Total War series by Creative Assembly is a set of turn-based strategies that revel in historical epochs from Sengoku period Japan right through to Napoleonic Europe and beyond. And indeed, as of May 2016, it's also entering more fictional realms of popular strategies such as Warhammer. Now, much like Call of Duty and other successful series that adopt an if it ain't broke, don't fix it, approach to core gameplay, each installment of the canonical Total War series follows a certain pattern, and it's neatly partitioned into administrative strategies on a map screen and also real-time battles. The ultimate goal with both of these sort of sets of gameplay is the expansion of one's empire and the eventual conquest of surrounding regions. Now, I think the genius of Total War and this dynamic that it employs is that it blends the quintessential god game that deals with the macrocosmic world building, sort of strategy, which is, akin to Civilization, Caesar, and Black and White, with the real-time, large-scale combat scenarios which are found in the likes of StarCraft and Age of Empires. Furthermore, and perhaps most importantly for me as someone that loves history, the games all hinge around a significant historical period of change or, political upheaval. And this offers, kind of contextual reference to the core, and it informs as well the core facets of gameplay and, for example, units that you're able to kind of utilize. Gunpowder, key inventions such as gunpowder or events that affected a lot of Europe, such as the Black Plague. These crop up every few turns, and for good or ill, can affect your conquest and your goals and your population's expansion and contraction, and the happiness of your people, or even the units that you're able to create. So yeah, it's quite an interesting dynamic to introduce. And alongside this, we have other tertiary and somewhat educational infographics that also pop up at certain dates, again, once enough turns have been cycled through. So the one I'm playing at the moment, which is Medieval, the invention of the clock kind of pops up, the discovery of the Americas pops up, and equally fascinating historically relevant facts, for a given time period. So as I mentioned, at the moment I'm playing Medieval 2, and I will hinge the talk loosely around this because it just happens to be the game I'm playing. But I've also dipped into other titles, and in fact I did start with Shogun Total War, which was the first installment of this series, which was released back in 2000. And those that have perused my channel, will have seen that, I cover games like Tekken, Final Fantasy, Tenchu, Bushido Blade. So it was really the Japanese warring samurai aspect of Shogun Total War that caught my eye and introduced me to this series. And to this day, ever since, I've gone through intense periods where my life kind of stops and I just have to play one of these games, largely to the detriment of work and relationships around me. But there we have it. So Medieval 2 is the installment I'm currently playing, and it marks a point where Creative Assembly had reached a kind of plateau of success off the back of Rome Total War, but at the same time it was relying on graphics and a gameplay engine that was arguably already outdated. And this was noted by some of the more critical reviewers at the time of its release. Indeed, Medieval 2 was the last game to use the TW2 engine, Total War 2 engine, and the following installment, Empire Total War, utilised a new engine, which really did revolutionise the gameplay and opened up the game graphically. It enabled maritime battles to kind of take place, which up until Medieval 2 we haven't been able to do. But that said, I do feel Medieval 2 subsists perfectly well without these advances, and as one of my favourite kind of historical periods as well, I am slightly biased towards it, but I think it has enough going for it to be a successful game in its own right. Now, looking more broadly at the series, and my game reviews I undertake in general, I usually like to delve quite deep and get into narrative structures and character analysis, as this is what really interests me about any medium really, and particularly video games. But the reason why Total War as a series is such an uncommon game genre for me is there is in fact a poverty of plot or consistent character arc, to be seen. And to this end, it is a wholly impersonal, objective gaming experience on the part of the player. But that's not to say it's a game that is, you're unable to forge an emotional attachment to. Quite to the contrary, in fact, I think that there is an addictive emotional psychology to Total War and an investment into one's faction and empire that in many ways supersedes the most emotive, plot-driven, character-led games out there. And I think this is, quite an egotistical reason, honestly, because ultimately the protagonist of a given Total War game is you, the player. You take the role of a faction leader, and everyone from diplomats to priests and merchants, assassins, spies, generals, they all take their cues from you, and you control them and move them about the board, and continue to do so until they age and expire, or die in battle or get assassinated. The player, you, the player, are the one constant in this turbulent world of political intrigue and war. And that, I think, this ability to play God over this dominion and exercise power in the pursuit of global conquest is the driving force of Total War's emotive and addictive quality that I've been subject to for many years now. There's also, I think, a testing of one's aptitude for strategy and this chess-like ability to move ahead and think 10 moves ahead. And that's in multiple different arenas. For example, one of your generals may be governing a province, which is helping keep the population orderly, and the general may have traits that boost annual income, and commerce in that particular, arena. But at the same time, he has a 5-star talent for commanding in battle, and your military units are in desperate need of some decent leadership due to their imminent advance on an enemy. So you will find that situations like this often occur, and on multiple fronts as well, depending on how you choose to play the game. On top of this, when it comes to medieval, particularly, you have the necessity of pacifying the Catholic Church, and whether you're a Christian or a Muslim nation, you can find yourself the target of a Catholic crusade if you consistently, advance on and destroy, other Catholic nations. Now, the psychology of video games has become an increasing area of academic discussion. In the 90s, and still today, I suppose, there's a question of whether video games are detrimental to one's health and whether games like Grand Theft Auto, are turning us all into kind of serial killers. More recently, however, there has been a more inquisitive and reasonable discourse around, video games and questions such as morality in the gaming world and titles where, players' choice affects character decisions in a game. And we find this in games such as Fallout and the Elder Scrolls series, for example. And, players playing games like this have come under scrutiny to see how one can react in a virtual world in situations of life and death and, good versus bad decisions, and situations. But I would argue that, and I think it's safe to say that Total War as a series and a handful of other games have been operating on this sort of player psychology for a long time now. The necessity of making and breaking alliances, the question around timing of and initiating betrayals, ousting merchants, assassinating generals, and all of these sort of things, these are all conscious decisions that are player determined. And even the most moral among us, may find an inclination towards ruthlessness, in these games as time wears on, in the name of conquest. Furthermore, we have the fallout from battle scenarios, and invariably a number of the enemy force will always be captured, and we are usually prompted with 3 courses of action to take, which is to ransom them, release them, or execute them. And each time this decision is taken, it has consequences, both in terms of gameplay and morality of the player character. So, for example, opting to execute might make you feel a bit guilty, but in doing so, you are ruthlessly putting down any further rebellion from this particular force, and increasing the dread trait of the commander of that particular battle, which makes future opponents more likely to rout and flee. Releasing foes, on the other hand, will be a chivalrous thing to do, and also encourage this trait in your generals and captains, and this in turn it gives your own army a morale boost, so they're less likely to flee. And finally, ransoming is a comfortable middle way that could potentially earn you some, money if you're short of that. But I just find these three kind of routes quite interesting, as they are the most commonly recurring in the fallout of battle scenarios in Total War. And also interesting, they are a common issue that you see cropping up on Total War forums. And I think it's really interesting, actually, to note that the people that post on these forums asking, which is the best course of action to take, usually deal in terms of economy and advantage, rather than the moral implications of executing 1,000 men after a battle, for example. Indeed, looking at a comparative real-world example and slightly digressing, I think it's probably easy to see how people in the finance industry became so morally wayward and caused things like the financial crisis in 2008, because when people are reduced to figures on a screen, just statistics, we all consider the more macrocosmic and self-interested factors, and these are merely pawns, numbers shuffling around on a screen. So I'm not trying to relate Total War to the financial crisis at all, but it's this whole gamification of morality that I find really quite interesting, both in the game world and in the reality of the thing. Anyway, kind of on the subject of income, the necessity of income is also a driving factor of Total War, and perpetual debt caused by building up your armies and constructing fortifications and amenities is where the more administrative strategy side of it comes in, and it's perhaps the necessary evil of Total War. As most, such as myself, who engage in this game just want to fight some really epic battles and kind of conquest my way through the map. But the benefits of merchants and ports and trade alliances is the catalyst to creating a wealthy empire and, by extension, a large army. Indeed, I do tend to prioritise my raw materials and merchants and trade routes before I expand my faction too far, because failing to capitalise on these things early on really does give you trouble later on when you're being invaded on 3 fronts and don't have the investment in units to put down invasion. Again, on this note, just turning to Medieval 2 for examples, another thing I'd like to touch on is historical and contextual authenticity and thematic coherence. This is just something that I noted recently and I really quite liked it. So Welsh archers are infamous. Welsh archers were really famous and came to prominence in the 12th century, and they were responsible for repeatedly repelling Norman invaders, and to this day, is the reason that Wales still has a relative sovereignty within, the rest of the United Kingdom. Once invaded in the Total War game in Medieval, the province of Caernarfon gives you the ability to create longbow units. So I think it just shows a degree of thought on the developers that they're attributing certain units, certain statistics, certain factors of gameplay to different regions within certain historical timeframes, and that's something that I really do find interesting, and I really kind of appreciate the historical accuracy that's gone into this sort of thing. And it's only a few exceptions really that they tend to take liberties with the accuracy of their timeline. So finally, I'd just like to wrap up. This has been a very brief overview, but it's just something I happen to be playing at the moment while I'm waiting for Final Fantasy XV to be delivered. I'd just like to wrap up on the actual, tangible, real-time battle dynamics, as it's one of the most exciting and engaging aspects of the Total War series for me. Being able to think and act strategically in a real-time, battle as a general, and literally be able to put into practice formation theories such as pincer attacks and fake routes and other tactics that wouldn't be out of place in Sun Tzu's Art of War, is really just an awesome aspect of gameplay. You're free to conduct battles as you please, and it's surprising to which the degree of strategy is needed, as you can't always win just by sheer numbers or having the most advanced units. It requires real pacing and thought to be able to work your way through these battles, all of which kind of takes a different turn. You never get one battle that is particularly the same, which is one of the driving factors of why I love this game so much. And very, very lastly, I would just like to wrap up on the music. And I think this does come through particularly well in the battle scenes as you're kind of warming up and advancing on a foe. But there is a certain epicness to the combat music, and all of the Total War games that I've played to date do have fantastic scores that really capture the setting and the mood of whatever scenario you happen to be in at that moment. So yeah, I'm not sure who the composer was, or actually I'm not sure of much of the Creative Assembly staff. I don't know their names or anything, but I just think it's a really excellent cohesive game, and the score really ties that together as well.